Denver, Colorado, or actually Golden's where we lived, and joined through the recruiting service down in Denver.
And I remember you told me this story off camera, so I guess I'll... Did you try to enlist in any other branches of service?
Yes. I'm also a ham radio operator, and I had two friends that were hams also, and we'd get talking most nights, late in the evening. And they were a couple of years older, so they had the draft board staring them right in the face. I mean, to the point of sending letters. And we decided we better go down and talk to the recruiters and try to do something. Because I knew I was going to go into service. College at that point just wasn't on the table. And so we went down, and actually the Army was very interested because of our communication background, and even had a major take us aside, talk to us about, would amount to working for ASA, Army Security Agency, as spies working out of embassies in civilian clothes and stuff. So, okay, well, that sounds kind of interesting. So we went and took the physical and all the written tests, and they had a very extensive battery of tests that turned out all three of us scored extremely high on. Unfortunately, in the physical, they determined I was colorblind and said I was 4F, which just floored me, especially since I grew up doing artwork. My mother was a commercial artist. And went home, told her, she said they're out of their mind. But the next morning I get a call from the Air Force recruiter say, we heard about your color vision, tell us, what's the story? And I told us I didn't know I had a problem till yesterday. I did flunk the color vision test very obviously, but didn't understand that. And so he said, well, if we throw down red, green, and blue yarn, can you tell us? I said, sure. He says, come on down. So I went down, identified their colored yarn, and took their written tests, and the rest was history. But I went in actually with the idea of being in electronics, and that held up through basic training, and they sent me back to Denver, about 20 miles from where I lived, for the training in electronics and fire control systems, F-105s. And about a week before school, they said, well, we see there's been a problem with your color vision. So they retested me, and of course I failed it again. And they gave me this sheet of paper, one page with a list of schools that didn't require color vision. And the only one on the list that was there at the base that we were at, Lowry, was photography. Well, I had taught myself photography in high school, the lab work. I'd been shooting pictures forever, but taught myself how to do all the lab work and stuff. Never even gave it a thought for the service, but I said, well, heck, I'll take photography, because at that time it was all black and white except for slides, so color vision wasn't required. And turned out that was one of those fairy godmother moments that it turned out to be extremely good move. So I went on and did my 13 weeks of photography, basic photography school, which was very interesting. And then I went on to Japan from there to work 2 years in the base photo lab.
So prior to that deployment, what were your first days like in the Air Force?
Well, basic training. We were down there for 5 weeks, and our recruiter told us, well, they're going to go down, they're going to scream at you and do all kinds of huffing and puffing, and just look at them and think, gee, in 5 weeks I'll be gone and you'll still be here, and just don't take it too serious. Just, do as they say. And so that's basically what happened. I went down there, we had some good TIs. We had a good crew. The whole 60, 70 guys were pretty sharp. And they got us aside about the third or fourth night. And he said, well, you kind of see what the story is here. As long as you look good out in front of everybody else, we're not going to bust you at all. And so we had, it was actually pretty good 5 weeks.
Now, did pilots train besides enlisted men? Were officers and enlisted men integrating at the same time?
Well, no, we were all enlisted. at that time, they did have the Air Cadet program still in effect. So if, once you completed basic and you've been in a year, you could apply, to either OCS, Officer Candidate School, or the cadets, and then go in and get commissioned and be trained that way. But people, the guys or girls just going in to be an officer, they go through a different program totally.
So what was your deployment like in Misawa?
Well, that was fun. I was over there in Base Photo Lab, which meant we were out taking pictures of anything and everything. And being in a foreign country, any incident that happened on base or off, we had to document. Even if you had, in your personal car, an accident downtown, we had to take pictures of it. If you lived off base or on base and somebody broke into your house, we had to go take pictures of that. So we did everything. A lot of information, PIO or public information stuff. Officers' Wives Club, you had to go take pictures there. Just, you name it, we did it. And the PIO work in particular ended to be interesting because the other guys in the lab hated it. They just didn't want any part of it. And I grew up in a social environment, so I knew how to talk to these people and how to act. And if I had to go up to officers' club, I'd go up. They didn't make me wear a uniform, so I'd go up in coat and tie and take my pictures, put the camera in the corner, and mingle. But I was known, by that time I was known around, amongst all the bigwigs anyway, so they knew who I was, and I behaved myself, so never was a problem. I had a ball.
So what kinds of airplanes were you flying out of Misawa?
At that time, we had F-100 fighter bombers, the F-101s for photo recon, and the F-102 interceptors.
Now, at that point, did you have any hand in developing photo reconnaissance photographs?
No, the 45th photo recon was shared the same building with us. We shared a few facilities like chemical, mixing and whatnot, but they were a separate organization, and they were pretty active. But
well, I was going to say, Northern Japan is very close to the Soviet Union.
Yeah, 6 minutes by air. So our defenses were, we had 4 102s sitting out slightly off the end of the runway that could be launched off in a matter of a minute or two. And I went out, the first time I saw them, I saw this. Of course, in northern Japan, it gets a lot of snow in the winter. And I asked the pilot that was kind of showing me around, I said, well, I know you guys try to keep the runway clear, but, what happens if it's really snowy? He says, we can fly this thing out of the hangar if we have to. Full afterburner and let go.
Well, the Delta wing, right?
Yeah.
That thing probably flies right up.
And it's pretty light, really. They just carried missiles. That's all they had. So, but they scrambled out quite a bit.
I can imagine the F-101 being a photo reconnaissance platform. Would that be the fastest aircraft of the 3?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That was their defense because they were totally unarmed. They just carried a lot of fuel. But more than once they came home full afterburner with a MiG hot behind them.
So how long was your deployment in Japan?
2 years.
2 years. And do you recall any exceptional circumstances, any events during that time overseas?
Oh, yes. Of course, I was there for the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that was a real tense time. And since then, I've learned even more about it and realized it was even more tense than we thought. And it was bad enough there. We had the F-100s with nukes hanging on them, sitting out ready to go with the pilots in the cockpit. So people were kind of holding their breath.
So the reverberations in the Caribbean.
Yes. Oh gosh, yes. Well, even I was there when Kennedy was assassinated, and we went as soon as word came out, we went on high alert because we don't know what was going to happen.
Now, on the flip side of the coin, being in northern Japan, were you ever approached by Soviet photo reconnaissance platforms?
They had. I didn't see any, but there were some stories of, I don't know if they were recon planes, but I know there was one story of a Soviet fighter pilot calling our tower saying he was low on fuel and requesting permission to refuel. And after a quick little talk with the base commander, they said, yeah, they let him come in and land. Of course, he escorted, and they gassed him up and sent him on his way. So, I mean, there's all kinds of stories, that happened. Yes, it was the Cold War, and there was another incident where one of our 100 pilots was out and got ambushed by a couple of MiGs, and they heard him yelling over the radio about it. And I can't remember if I know they shot him down, but whether he survived, I can't remember. But one of the pilots had heard this, ran out and grabbed the first 100 that was parked out front, came back holding up two fingers and smiling. So.
And did you ever see any of their maritime patrol aircraft, like Bear bombers or anything like that?
Well, yeah, one time. I had a deal. Our commander for the photo lab, amongst his other many duties, he ran base ops and stuff too. But we had several of the North American T-39s, a little Saberliner, that they use for ferrying around, and the base commander and some of the other high officers would fly, 4 hours or more a month just to keep their flight pay and their flight status and stuff. And Colonel Benier told me that anytime I wanted to, hop on for a ride, just do it, just show up, and there was an empty seat that I was welcome. And so I did that on occasion. And one of the times we'd gone way up north, up by Wakanai and over northern Hokkaido, and tried to sneak back in, to play games with our radar. And the pilot came on the intercom and said, well, if you'll see that light over there about a mile away, that's a Bear bomber. And so that's as close as I got to one.
Now, from Misawa, or rather, I believe another off-camera story, were there ever any disturbances or riots at the base?
Oh,
kind of a loaded question here.
Yeah, not while I was there.
Oh, okay.
But I also heard in Japan, at least at that time, the Communist Party was very active and it was perfectly legal. They could do, just like any other group, and they were known to protest and demonstrate out in front of our bases from time to time. Mostly down in Tokyo area, because we had a lot of bases down there, a lot of facilities. And while I was there, I didn't know of one, but I'd heard and actually saw a picture of the plane one time before I got there, that they had a big demonstration set up, and actually did in front of the base. And so our guys, just as a little deterrent, parked an F-100 few hundred yards inside the gate, let the nose wheel down, let the air out of the tires, and drop the nose with 4 20 millimeter cannons aimed at the gate. They didn't have any problems.
Just a deterrent.
A little deterrent, yes.
So now from Misawa, where did you go in the world?
Well, after when it was about time to leave, the standard procedure was to let you go and make a couple of choices of where you might want to go if they had an opening. And I'd looked around, and I'd never been to Arizona, but it looked real interesting, especially living in Colorado at the time. And so I put in for Luke and Williams Air Force Base in Phoenix. Thought, gee, that'd be nice, get out in the sun, after being 2 years and climate very similar to New England. only not quite as long a winter, but probably at least as intense. And one day I get a phone call from personnel saying, "Gee, we got a special assignment for you." It was Westover Air Force Base in Chicopee, Mass. Well, we had a vague idea of what was going on there. It was something very special, but I had no other idea than that. And it was one of these things like, "Gee, I don't want it." "No, you're going." They turned out they had the authority to pluck anybody in the Air Force that they wanted.
So,
period.
An offer you couldn't refuse.
That's right. And I guess because I had physics and science, physics and chemistry and all that in high school, they decided that maybe they wanted me. So I ended up coming to Westover, and liked it so much I ended up spending 4 years. I re-enlisted and stayed there for the 4 years that we were allowed to stay. That was our freeze. After that, we were ripe for Vietnam, and then I went to Vietnam. but
for your service at Westover, I noticed a unique military ribbon.
Yes, oh yes. I can talk about this now because it was declassified in 1995 by President Clinton. At the time when I got there, though, this was an extremely secret operation. Wrong name on the building on purpose. We weren't allowed to breathe that we did photography. Of course, I show up one day with my ball cap from Misawa, which for identification purposes there on the flight line said Base Photo Lab. Well, boy, they about ripped my head off getting rid of that thing. You can't tell anybody you even do photography. Okay, well, it was a fascinating assignment. We did, at that time, the work we did was all film. Digital didn't exist then, and we were doing satellite photography. And
what satellite series would these be?
It's the Corona, for the most part. There's some others, but that was the major thing. But they had a satellite patrol, and they'd about once a month. Now we had other jobs come in too, but once a month this one came in, and we processed it and did dupe films, not paper prints, but actually a clear, positive print on a film that you could actually look through, and they used viewers that they could blow it up on a big screen and stuff. But
so, what was the size of the original negative?
70 millimeter. This was our primary mission, and we also had a lot of 9-inch that we did too. But
would 9-inch be from a different platform?
Mm-hmm.
Like a U2, something like that?
Well, different places.
Okay, I understand. So, can you describe the process from start to finish, from the satellite blasting off at Vandenberg to you receiving the negative?
Well, okay. Like I say, they had to say that they usually... this is all on the net now, so I'm not giving away any big secrets. In '76, they actually quit doing film, and it's all digital now in real time. But they would fly for 30 days and take photographs. In some places, every pass, sometimes once a week, sometimes. It just depended on the priority of the target. But at the end of the 30 days, they would eject this package. It would re-enter the atmosphere out near Hawaii. And there was an organization out there that went out and actually snagged the parachutes as they were coming down and retrieved the package of film. It would be sent back here, and we worked with Kodak, and we shared duties there, and we'd process it and then make numerous copies for various organizations that were.
Now, how many prints would be taken on one of these patrols? I mean, how many negatives would you have to process and develop?
Well,
can you give it like an estimate of the length of one of these film reels?
Well, it was probably a mile of film.
And how many prints would you make?
I don't. Well, we do like 20 or 30 copies of each.
20, 30 miles of film.
Yeah. It took a while to do, and to give a little idea, of course, as time went on, the processes improved and speeded up. We found better ways and faster ways to process the film. But when I first got there, there were several times we worked for 30 days without a day off, doing 12-hour shifts. So.
What were the developing machines like?
Well, they were pretty, I mean, more to say they're state of the art, they were the art. It wasn't immersion like the regular guys use. This was all spray process. And it was fairly fast. It just trying to keep because this stuff, when it was processed, had to be perfect. There was no room for error. I mean, we're precision photo processing technicians were our title, and they meant it. This stuff had to be right on, and we did a lot of research and development while we were also doing a production job. And they learned a lot as they went along, and they found faster ways and more efficient ways of getting the job done. We ended up with one machine for our primary mission that ran 270 feet a minute. It was a huge machine, and that thing could empty itself in a heartbeat. You were doing a lot of rethreading then if you had a film break. But
so what kind of conditions existed in this facility?
It was a clean room environment. It was explained to me, there were bigger clean rooms, but they weren't as clean, and there were cleaner clean rooms, but they weren't as big. This thing was huge. The building itself was amazing.
So sealed suits, gloves.
Oh yeah, we had the bunny suits, the whole bit, air showers, very, very clean, very clean. You're dealing with film that you can look at with a 50-power microscope and see the breed of a dog. You don't want dust spots.
So how does that compare to public access satellite technology?
Google is a joke by comparison. Well, I mean, it's neat, it really is. But in the 60s, what we did was unbelievably better.
Now, is there any way to develop a three-dimensional print from numerous two-dimensional photographs?
Well, there was two different ways of doing it. One is when you're shooting recon film, whether it's an airplane or satellite or whatever, or drone, you do it so they overlap. And the idea being, if you lose one frame, you have enough overlap that you still have all the coverage. Well, because you have these staggered things, you can take a stereo viewer and look at them, and it'll pop right up in stereo, in 3D. On our project, we actually ran two cameras, so we shot in stereo automatically anyway, but that was partially in case one of them failed, and we still had recoverable.
Now, are there any safety measures in the satellite film? Let's say if one of the, what would it be, like a C-119 or a C-130, and wasn't able to pick it up?
Yeah, well, they were designed so if it hit the salt water, there were plugs that would dissolve and they'd go to the bottom, and the salt water would go in and ruin the film. And so
completely deniable.
Yep. No retrievable information.
And
never lost one though that I'm aware of.
I can only imagine things that would happen to the pilot. But now, how would you retrieve the film from Rochester?
Oh yeah, well, a lot of times they process the original. Sometimes we did. We both had the setups to do that. But if Rochester, New York, home of the big white father in the yellow box, if they process the originals, instead of doing like they did at the base with nuclear stuff when they were transferring it and having 100 cops around a thing, our guys, there were two couriers who went fishing for a few days, took their personal station wagon and disappeared. sidearms, being watched like a hawk, I am sure, but just very low key. They'd come back with the job. And
so, considering the sensitive nature of your work, what kind of personal security did you have on the base, or even what kind of surveillance would you have on your person?
Oh boy, yeah. When I first got there, I did a lot of touristing. Having grown up in Oklahoma and then a little bit Colorado, never been back here, and the history and stuff in New England was just amazing. I put many, many miles on my car, traveling around the little byways around New England, and my roommate usually went with me. And short order, we found out when we got back, we were told where we had been. We were watched very closely to see who might be, not that we were going to get together with anybody, but somebody might try to get to us. And they wanted to know who we were associating with. And if you were known to be associating around the wrong people, you left.
Now, did the Air Force give you a cover story for what you did at the base?
It is not really. They just don't talk. You know, one of the guys says, "What am I supposed to tell them? I'm a B-52 pilot." But at the time, in our fatigues, they not only had your name, but instead of saying Air Force, they had your organization. And ours at the time was the 65 94th Test Squadron. Well, people in the chow hall, they'd see us, well, what do you guys test? And we'd say personnel endurance. How many 12-hour shifts can you work? So
what would have happened? What was standard operating procedure if, let's say, somebody goes out on a Friday night and starts to talk about what they did?
One of the things we were told is if you heard somebody spouting off, the code word was, you say, "That's garbage," as you bury your fist in his mouth and put him out of commission.
Did that ever happen?
Not that I'm aware of. Our guys were pretty careful. They liked where they were and they didn't want to jeopardize it.
Now, can you put a dollar amount or kind of a comparative value to the facility established by the Air Force in Westover for satellite reconnaissance development?
God, I don't know how many billions went into that place. It was, I can't tell people, I think it was worth about half of what Chicopee was worth. But if you saw it, especially after some of the remodels they did and stuff, the lab was like walking on the set of Star Trek. I mean, it was just unbelievable. Very state of the art and then some. We had 3 computer systems that helped run things, and that's when computers were really just evolving, to being really useful. But we had a system that ran the air conditioning, because each room had its own temperature control, pressure control. Pressure was critical because the cleanest areas had to have the highest pressure, and the dirtier areas had lower pressure, so that pushed the stuff out. So you had a computer that ran that. You had one that ran the process of the chemical processing of the film that kept track of all that. You had another one that kept track of the material as we printed it. So we knew, we made sure we had everybody's work done that needed to be done.
So did the Air Force ever shoot in color, or was it all black and white?
What I saw there was strictly black and white. Now in Vietnam we did some color, infrared color. Now,
what were the benefits of using infrared?
Well, the primary thing was that with infrared, all that nice green foliage that was over there showed up bright red. If you had fake foliage, like camouflage, it was dark green, the color it normally was. So when we had a downed pilot in the middle of the night, we'd fly the area in infrared. Bingo, there he is. They'd send the chopper in and pluck him out.
So moving on to Vietnam. Okay, so you get off the plane in Tonson. Well, actually, the night before.
Oh, yeah.
Off the plane in Tonson. I believe that's where the story starts.
Yeah, we left Travis Air Force Base I was very fortunate too. My roommate at Westover, well, him and I both ended up getting married before we left, but we were roommates for 3+ years of the 4 years I was there. But we ended up getting orders to Vietnam together, same outfit. We ended up sharing a bunk in the NCO barracks at Tan Son Nhut. But anyway, we flew over together on this. It was in Braniff, I think. They were one of the charter flights. And then we got into Hawaii for our little gas stop and stuff. And they claimed they had radio problems. I don't know if they did or not after what went on when we got there. But they put us up overnight in the Reef Tower Hotel overlooking Diamond Head right on Waikiki Beach. So we got the cruise around there for about a day before they got the plane ready. And the next night we were flying into, we went from there to Clark Air Base in the Philippines, which is now closed. But it was even hotter in Vietnam. We were there at 4 in the afternoon. It was horrible. But then we got into Saigon like 7, 8 o'clock at night, something like that. And they say we're on a commercial airliner. It was a charter job. And they told us, that when we got in near landing, they were going to kill all the lights in the plane because they don't want to be a target. And they go in hot. And they said, if you happen to hear a loud noise in the back of the plane, it's the speed brakes. And I'm going, speed brakes on an airliner? Okay. They didn't deploy them, but we went in hot. And there's flares hanging in the sky all around as we're landing. And you walk off the plane and it's like walking into a shower. I mean, it's hot, humid. But we eventually got dumped out in a barracks area. There was some old French barracks they were remodeling. There was cement, which was not usual there. Most of them were wood, screen wire stuff, but these were cement. And they said, grab a air mattress and blow it up and, camp out for the night. We'll see you back personnel in the morning. And if you feel something nibbling on your ear, it's just one of the rats. I'm like, okay, thanks.
Welcome to Vietnam.
Yes, and then we decided, after all this, we needed to go find a bathroom or a latrine, military jargon. So we start out, we're in a row of, rows of buildings. So we go out on the sidewalk, and sure enough, we see a GI hiking along. It's all dark because the base is under attack. Or we're hearing on the radio down a few doors down, they had a air police guard shack, and we heard the radio talking about stuff going on. And so we asked this fella, where the latrine was, and he said, well, that's where I'm headed, just follow me. So, okay. So we could go down a few more buildings and go inside and get in where the lights are. And I graduated high school with a kid. We're like, what are you doing here? Yes, and that wasn't the only time I ran into somebody I knew, but that was quite a surprise. And so we ended up, spending the night there about 1 in the morning. During that time too, he did say, if you have a radio with you, turn it to 99.9, which we did. It was what they call Lone Star. That was our little base station. They played music all the time, unless something was happening. Then they'd come on and say, we got incoming or whatever, just to let you know what was happening. So we had that playing in the background. And about 1 in the morning, we hear whap, whap, whap. These rockets start falling around us. About that time, Lone Star says, oh, we got incoming. Yeah. And they landed probably a half mile away over at the heliport. But anyway, so I was welcome to Vietnam.
So would these be RPGs or something bigger?
There were
the B-40?
the 117 millimeter rockets. I think it was 105 or 117. I'm tired. God, it's been a while. But anyway, it was the rockets they usually fired at us. It was not unusual, it turned out. But
And how did they launch those? How far away were they firing from?
well, I'm not sure just what their range was. Because we put so much pressure on them, normally they didn't get to use their launchers. And I understand during TET they did. In fact, some of the guys that were living off base down in one of the hotels downtown when TET hit actually sat in a window and watched these guys right out in the street with a launcher firing off these missiles. Well, at night like that, usually what they did is they went out and set them up with a couple of sticks to hold the thing up and have an alarm clock with a battery to set it off. They'd set it for like 1 o'clock, go home, go to bed, and at 1 o'clock this thing went off, and but it went to whom it may be concerned.
So you think that was more of a psychological warfare weapon?
Yeah. Oh yeah, very definitely a terror weapon. When they used their launchers, they were deadly accurate. I mean, they hit what they shot at.
These are probably Chinese or Soviet made.
Oh yeah. Well, I think they were Russian. We had a Chi-Com recoilless round hit one time, killed a kid. It was the only casualty that I was aware of, and had been a GI, came back as a tech rep, fired into one of the hangars nearby, but most of it was Soviet stuff. But sometimes we'd go for days when nothing would happen, and other times we'd get hit a lot. But it was almost always at night.
So what exactly were your responsibilities in Vietnam?
Well, there we had a photo recon operation. There was about 30 trailers that were set up. These trailers were designed usually with machines already in them. Each had a function, and they had a bigger trailer with a big table and cabinets and stuff for plotting stuff or whatever. I mean, they're multifunctional things, and they were designed to actually load into C-130s and fly them wherever. And they had trailers for mixing chemicals, and you had all the connections that you could connect the whole thing up. And it was quite an extensive operation. I think we had 9 film processors and a bunch of printers, and I don't remember all the specs, but it was big. I got there just as it was cranking up. Now we were flying 20 to 30 missions a day. We were one of 3 photo operations there. We were the 460th, and then we did North Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The 16th was right next door to us, and another set of trailers, and they did South Vietnam. And then the 12th Ritz was in a building over by 7th Air Force headquarters, and they were inside. And they did U-2, drones, and other assorted stuff that came along.
More CIA oriented.
Yeah, that's special stuff. But our operation, the first month we did 1 million feet of film, and it went up from there. That's how many missions we were flying.
What kind of airframes were the reconnaissance pilots flying?
The RF-101s and RF-4Cs primarily, RB-66, RB-57s occasionally, but mainly the 4Cs and the 101s.
And how would those cameras differ from satellite photography?
Oh, geez. Well, the 101s used 2 9-inch cameras. They shot high altitude, usually about 40,000 feet, and they covered a big area, and you had a 9 by 18-inch frame that showed quite a bit. The 4Cs shot 5-inch primarily, and they were in a fan array. They could shoot straight down, but they also off to the sides. They also had one that shot an oblique, looking down at an angle from the nose. They also had 2 other cameras, and I can't remember now if it's 70 millimeter or 5-inch, but they had a low pan and a high pan. The high pan, they didn't use as much. It went from horizon to horizon in a sweep. But the low pan was the real good one. It did the same thing, horizon to horizon. It was a spinning lens. It didn't have a shutter. It had a spinning lens. And they usually would fly at 1,000 miles an hour at 500 feet. And by the time somebody knew they were there, they were a mile away, and they'd already gotten their picture. And very effective.
Big engines in that.
Yes, it was hauling.
Did you ever have any casualties among the aircraft?
Not that I'm aware of. Occasionally, we'd have a pilot come and sit on the machine that was processing his negatives. He says, I get shot at, and I want to make sure these things came out okay. Now, whether he got hit or not, he didn't say, but he knew he'd been shot at. So,
both those aircraft are very high speed, right?
Yeah. Well, the danger we ran into with when I first got there was that up north they had some radar controlled guns, 3-inch anti-aircraft guns that were accurate at 40,000 feet, and that was a real threat to the 101. So we made a big push to locate those sites and take them out right away.
So, explain a little more. What was it mission-oriented, mission-specific choice to use black and white or infrared film?
I think I'm not sure what actually brought them into the infrared, but I think it was primarily when they had a pilot they were looking for, because otherwise you just had a big sea of red, from all the foliage. But something that wasn't natural, stood right out.
So a camouflage truck, something like that.
Yeah.
So up north and in Laos and Cambodia, what photographs, what targets would they be looking for?
I'm not sure.
That's very sensitive.
Yeah, well, we'd go over to the photo interpreter's shop. They were in a nice air conditioned building. We'd go over there quite often, just see what they're up to. Especially sometimes, even if they were looking for something specific, we'd grab a roll of film and go through to help them out. But there was also briefing booklets that came out every day that from different organizations, some of them secret, some of them top secret, that made some interesting reading too. But as a photo interpreter, you had to be intimately familiar with the area you were looking at as far as the history, the geography, the current events, so that when you looked at that picture, it made sense to you.
You need the context.
Yeah, and also, sometimes you were looking at a change from day to day to day.
So with all this photography, did you get acquainted with Soviet bloc equipment, things like that?
Well, I can't say that, we saw stuff from there, but didn't necessarily identify it as being, well, that's an SA, whatever. The only thing I actually really saw was a kind of a fluky thing. They had a very poor example of a tank. This is more like an armored personnel carrier than a real tank, but what I saw of it. But anyway, it was down near Saigon, and one of our recon pilots spotted it. Of course, the 101s didn't have any armament on them, but he had a couple fuel tanks, and I think he was just heading out. So he went in low and deposited a couple fuel tanks on it, burned it to a cinder, killed the crew. And they towed it into Tan Son Nhut, and we got to see it. But fortunately, they didn't have any real tanks down there, and I gather up north they did. But.
So, now, did you ever experience any combat experience, any attacks on the airbase? Were you there for Tet?
No, I got there right after Tet. In fact, the day we got there, they had a battle right next to where our barracks were. Our barracks were in a containment area that was right on the edge of the base, but it was on the Saigon side. And right across the fence, or 3 fences, was a French girls' school and an old French cemetery. And our guys had actually pushed this battalion of North Vietnamese regulars, they weren't DC, they were regulars, into that graveyard and killed them all off over time. It took a while. And they had the Sky Raiders dropping 500 pounders, just boom, 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 boom. They said the barracks was bouncing. Now, this all happened before, while we were en route, but the idiot kids, when we got there, they were sneaking out there somewhere or another. I don't know how they got through the 3 fences and plucking up souvenirs off these dead NVA, which...
Were there mines between some of those fences?
Yes, there were. So how they got there, I don't know, and I really didn't care. It's just totally insane.
They're lucky the rocks didn't get them.
Yes, I was a little older than a lot of them, and I guess maybe common sense prevailed.
So, can you describe, it seems like almost every Vietnam veteran has had some kind of interaction with the Republic of Korea Marines.
Oh, yeah, well, mine wasn't Marines, mine was Air Force. During about, 8 or 9 months after we were there, we had a little space. Like I say, the barracks was right there on the perimeter. But there was 3 fences, and there was mines between 2 of them, and then there was a roadway that went around, and a lot of the air crews and stuff went out and jogging and stuff, so they stayed in case they had to walk out of the jungle, they'd be in shape. So there was, in one spot there where there was kind of a bend, there was a bigger open area, and it turned out that they built a couple of barracks there for South Korean Air Force. And they camped out there, and they were welcomed greatly. We did whatever we could for those boys, because the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were scared to death of them. They played dirty.
The rules of engagement were a little relaxed.
Yes, and so we never had any concerns after those guys were there. I mean, it didn't stop the rockets, but as far as any personnel coming through there, it wasn't likely to happen.
So do you recall any interactions with CIA, intelligence, anything while you were overseas?
Not directly.
I mean, I don't know how they would. I mean, they probably didn't dress like James Bond.
Oh, no.
Or wear safari suits.
No. Now, the way Westover, actually, we did work with them, but I never had any direct contact with them. But a lot of our projects involved them greatly. Now, later on, when I was in Oklahoma working at a photo lab, I actually ran one of 4 labs that this fellow owned. I had a customer come in who had been in Vietnam too, and he was one of the very first to go back to Vietnam on one of these tours for ex-GIs. It was one of the very first they did, and he had a videotape that they had produced, for this trip, or during the trip. And he wanted some copies made of it, and we got talking and stuff. And he said, well, make a copy for yourself, which unfortunately I don't have anymore, but make a copy for yourself too. And but then talking with him, I have an idea he was CIA. This story, I knew enough to know what I was hearing, and there were a lot there. I mean, they just. When the embassy got attacked, they were neat up to here and that. Believe me, trying to protect the embassy and stuff.
There's I remember seeing pictures coming out of men in short sleeve white shirts and ties carrying Tommy guns.
Yeah.
That doesn't scream the U.S. Army.
No, no.
But so. Are there any exceptional circumstances, any events that come to mind during your Vietnam service, stories that stand out in memory?
Well, my personal thing, I also, being a ham radio operator and photographer and whatnot, I also acquired an interest in broadcasting. And AFVN, Armed Forces Vietnam, was there, of course, in Saigon. They also were around some of the other areas of the country, and they even had the aircraft that flew at night running movies and stuff, so the guys out in the boonies could see stuff. But the big station there was in Saigon. In fact, if you ever saw Good Morning Vietnam with Robin Williams, of course, it wasn't filmed there, but that was the story about Adrian Conower and his thing. Well, I got to AFVN right after Adrian left. And basically the Army ran it, but it was multi-service. And I told them, my background. I said, hey, if you don't mind, I'd like to come in and do a little volunteer work, on my days off. And they welcomed me. So I did TV production work. I'd spend a day and a half down there when I was off from the recon, and ended up generally from the 6 o'clock news till sign off. I ran the audio board right next to the director who's doing the video. And during the day, we do production stuff. They'd have some visiting entertainer or whatever. They do shows, and we videotape them. And so it was fun. It was a different aspect. Turned out, unbeknownst at the time, there was a gentleman who was just another rat GI like me named Pat Sajak there at the station. And obviously he's done a lot better for himself than I did. But that was an interesting side. But it was fun. And they did AM radio, they did FM, and they did TV. And AM radio was rock and roll. It was a show just to watch the DJ and they're doing his thing. And Gary W. Gears ended up taking over from Adrian when he left and followed his tradition with the Good Morning Vietnam stuff. Unfortunately, Gary's not with us anymore. He died at a pretty young age, but he had very extensive background from Chicago, though, in radio. And most of the guys there were broadcast professionals that either got drafted or volunteered, and got accepted into doing that kind of work because they had the background. So and one kid, it was kind of fun. I got to be pretty good friends with, who did FM, and he did more of the classical side, which I enjoyed. And I'd sit in the booth with him while he was doing the show, and we'd talk while records were playing. And he'd try to project this, image by the fire with the pipe in your mouth, to really do it up. But the funny part was the kid stuttered until that mic came on, and he was perfect. But that mic went off. And he made fun of himself about it. Anytime he wrote a note, he'd write RRR Rick. But I think Mel Tillis is another one that's like that. He's when he has to be good, he is.
So on the topic of entertainment, did you ever see a USO show while you were in Vietnam?
I saw some of them come through the station, and we did stuff. In fact, even in Massawa, we helped out with the audio sound system with some USO shows. So they're greatly appreciated. In fact, something we were talking about a little bit ago, while I was in Massawa, Raymond Burr came to the base and just made a stop, and we took a picture of him stuffed into an F-102. He's a big gentleman. Later, while I was in Vietnam, I really didn't know that much about it at the time, but learned a lot towards the end of it or afterwards, that he came to Vietnam a lot, not known. He didn't want people to know he was there. He didn't want the publicity. He wasn't like some of the others. But he'd go not to the big shows like in Saigon. He went to the fire bases out where they were getting shot at. Boy had a lot of guts and was highly respected, very well thought of. But he wanted to be out with the guys. So that was good. But we Bob Hope came there while I was there, and I didn't go there. Actually, I went and saw Billy Graham. He put on a heck of a program, too.
Do you remember any other notable personalities in country? I think Kel Welch went down there.
Oh, God. Well, most of the ones I met at the station, well, Gypsy Rose Lee was one, but was country singers and stuff, because most of the lifers were from the South and they liked country music, and so that was a big draw. but I can't think of all. There was just all kinds of people came through there. One of the ones thing I thought was interesting too was a performer who was not obviously not now, was an active duty Marine, was Martha Ray. She was a major or lieutenant colonel. Martha Ray. That was just astounded me because you don't get to be a Marine officer and just be horsing around. Those guys earn what they have.
You got that. So, due to the sensitive nature of your work, just like Westover, photo reconnaissance in Vietnam was probably pretty sensitive. Did you have any travel restrictions?
Well, my restriction was because of Westover. Yeah.
So there's a legacy that followed you there?
Yeah. As far as what we did actually in Vietnam, yeah, it was, I guess most of it would be considered secret, but it wasn't, super thing. It was a combat operation type of thing. But because of my time at Westover, I had a restriction that I was only allowed at Tan Son Nhut or Saigon City, period. Nowhere else in country under any circumstances. Had a thing in the front page of my records, had a copy of it on me all times that I could not be put where I could be captured.
So with that in mind, and also being a staff sergeant, were you ever issued a personal sidearm? Or?
Yeah, we were allowed to. That was, and it was kind of an outgrowth of Tet. The Air Force always seems to be a little behind on arming their people. They're technicians, they're not infantry. Shades back to Korea when all the Chinese in the world came down the peninsula. The only people left to defend the base were the cops. They were the only ones that even had weapons available. They evacuated everybody else as they could. After that, they started at least training the guys and saying, okay, here's how you shoot an M1. But at Tan Son Nhut, I guess they started handing out weapons, when all this started coming down, and the only real casualties, nobody fatalities, but the only guys hurt, was from our own guys shooting each other or shooting at each other because they were scared and they were, young and inexperienced and didn't live with a weapon like the Army does, So when I got there, you had to be an NCO, staff sergeant or above, to have a sidearm or M16, in which case if we were going to go downtown or somewhere on the backside of the base or something, we could check one out. Otherwise, unless they were coming through the gate, no, they're coming over the fence.
So that means, did you have to qualify on a variety of weapons?
Well, yeah, the M1 carbine, the M16, in fact, before I went to Vietnam, we stopped for 3 days at Hamilton Air Force Base to get better acquainted with the M16 and booby traps and whatnot. And we shot them full automatic and even had one with a grenade launcher, a 40 millimeter grenade. We shot those, and they taught us about booby traps and stuff.
I remember looking at your service ribbons. You received a small arms expert.
Yeah, I can hit what I want. Actually, I grew up shooting a bow, but I got.
The Air Force didn't issue those?
No. No, actually, if I'd been out in the field, I would have had one. Guarantee you. It was something that could probably help there. It was, again, at Massawa. We had a tech sergeant that lived in the barracks that I lived in who was on the base shooting team. And so he kind of took me under his wing, and we'd go out to the base range sometimes on weekends and shooting an M1 Grand at 500 yards and hitting consistently with a peep sight. Well, you're prone at that range, but still. But anyway, so I had some good training. But qualified M16, M1, the Grand. That was basically it. But over there, and some guys brought their own pistols with them. Occasionally, you have somebody with a shotgun. The cops on base used shotguns, so they shot towards an airplane. They'd just pepper the skin. We'd put holes in it.
What kind of base security did you have?
Well, we had the the air cops, of course, and then we had 82nd Airborne all around the place. But
Probably good feeling.
yes, they did. We tell you what, we take our hats off to them every chance we got. They were super.
Did you have any dusters for point defense?
Oh no, there was a quad 50 that was a 450 caliber machine guns mounted in a quad array on the back of a 6x, and they'd park that up by the main gate at night in case somebody decided to come through. And in the morning, you'd hear them clear it, and you'd boom, 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 boom. But never really had any big thing happen. A few times they had some commando cars too. They're like little mini tanks, but with big wheels, big tires on them and stuff. But they had a 105 recoilless and some other machine guns and stuff. And we see those doing about 70, 80 mile an hour up to the main gate sometimes. But they do fly. And also we had a couple tanks around. Saw those go up there occasionally, but never. If anything happened, it was kept there.
So, following your deployment at Thompson Nut, what was it like working at Beale?
Oh, okay, yeah. After a short break in service, we ended up out in Beale Air Force Base in Northern California, up above Sacramento.
And you continued your tradition of photographic reconnaissance?
Oh, yes, I got back in photo recon. The 9th Strategic Wing. They were flying the SR-71, the Blackbird, and
I suppose for the camera, you'd probably, what is the significance? What is the purpose of the SR-71?
Well, the SR is a kind of plane that can go wherever it wants to, when it wants to. Most times you don't even know it's there, and if you do, it doesn't matter. You can't do anything about it anyway. And it flies very fast, very high, and can photograph a huge area at one time. One of the missions we had was China, and they could photo map all of China in 3 hours.
Now, would that be with side-looking camera, side-looking radar?
Well, it was never optical sensors, and they did side-looking radar. I saw the units, and I occasionally saw the film, but our primary thing was the optical sensors.
So they were doing overflights then?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. And the big mission then was Vietnam, because it was 70 to 72, so Vietnam was still very active. And a lot of it was Saigon, or not Saigon, but Hanoi and Haiphong. One thing, to try and keep track of where our prisoners were, because the last thing we want to do is hit near them. But, the real close-in bomb assessment. I mean, we see the smile on the guy's face.
So you went from the breed of dog on a satellite to...
No, it was good. When you figure, well, they weren't up quite as high as the satellite, but they were high.
So, as opposed to the RF-101, the RF-4C, what kind of cameras were in place on an SR-71?
Honestly, I can't remember. That's embarrassing. I've been all over that bird too, but I don't remember just what cameras we were using.
Now, I think, what was the name of the operation for photographing China?
Oh, Giant Dragon.
And what kind of targets, like nuclear power plants, things like that?
They just overflew the whole thing, and then I'm sure they had their targets that they looked for. I never got into the intelligence side that much there. It was such a big operation. Our building was an old Sage Center, which may not ring any bells except for the old timers. Sage was a computer-driven interceptor. It was like
a Nike?
Well, more like, no, it was like, I think it was the 106, F-106, another Delta. But the idea was they'd make the acquisition on radar, and they would fly the plane. The pilot would take it off, turn it over to the Sage system, and it'd fly him out to the target.
It's almost like a UAV.
Yeah. And this building was like 6 stories high and a block, and the only windows in it was down by the entrance. And it was all, at one time, it had been all computer. It was old tube-type computers, you know. The thing was huge. Well, we took it over and we were doing our photo stuff in there. But there was only one entrance. And
now, then, the frequency of the SR flights, would it be per operational requirement, or was it like a satellite patrol?
Well, normally they flew at least once a day, but when I was there, they started flying 2 times a day because of, and they were actually flying out of Okinawa, is where they were, Kadena Air Base, but because they wanted that close, you know, keep that close an eye on what was happening. In fact, because they were doubling the flights, they were actually packed up some stuff and were sending over so they could do more processing at Kadena. And I was supposed to have gone with them on one of these deployments, but since my son was due to be born during that time, they didn't make me go. So I never did get to Kadena, but talked with them quite a bit because we did, while I was waiting to get my clearance updated, just happened, being a ham radio operator happened to pay off, because otherwise I'd been out mowing lawns. But I happened to mention to the first sergeant that I was a ham, and he said, "Just a minute, I got somebody to talk to you." So he calls Don and down the flight line, and he says, "What kind of license you got?" And I said, well, at that time it was general class. He says, "Good, come on down." We did phone patches on ham radio between, because at that time Okinawa was still U.S. territory. And we did phone patches so the guys could talk to their families a couple times a week on the over radio, the over phone.
So, speaking of which, how did you keep in touch with your family while you were overseas?
Well, going to Japan, I wrote occasionally. I got to where I learned to write letters. You don't write them, you don't get them. But in Vietnam, I had just gotten married 3 weeks before I got orders for Vietnam. Didn't leave for 4 months, but my wife and I met actually on ham radio. She was a ham, so. Not now, but she was then. And so they, at Tonsanut, they had a Mars station set up, and Barry Goldwater had a station that a lot of the phone patches ran through, and there's several other guys had big stations set up. And that's what they did. They ran patches all day, you know, as long as the conditions held up. And so I'd go over to the Mars station, you know, typically at least once a week, and see, you know, if the conditions were good. Well, there were sometimes they were marginal and they weren't good enough that the average guy would think they were talking on a phone. And I said, "Hey, you know, I'm a ham, my wife's a ham. We're used to talking through static." So I'd go back, sit on the radio with my headphones on, and we'd talk for, kept the circuit open, and you know, we might miss a word here or there, but we could talk. In fact, how good it was, the day I got to I guess it was the next day after we got to Tonsanut. After we went through personnel, we went right over to the outfit, and I was in the front trailer, and I said, "Well, you know, if you don't mind, I'm going to call the Mars station," because it used to be, the thing was they'd send messages. You know, not phone calls, just messages, you know, "Hey, I'm here, you made it okay, hi," you know, whatever. And so I called the Mars station to have him just send her a message. And he says, "What's your phone number?" And I'm going, "Oh, God." Because when we were dating, she had her own phone, and I knew that number cold, but she moved back with her parents while I was in Vietnam, and their number, I hadn't dialed that much. Amazingly, I pulled it out of my head, gave it to him. 30 seconds later, she's on the phone.
Quite a system. Yeah,
I was astounded. I just, wow, this is neat. You know, I'm here. You know, like, so. But then we, you know, over the time we talked some on the radio. But tremendous setup.
And now were you able to access like military antenna? Like what kind of? I mean, you're broadcasting from thousands of miles away.
Yeah, the Mars stations it's what's called military affiliate radio system. They have their own antennas, their own transmitters and stuff. There they were operating on military frequencies. They weren't on ham frequencies like we were between Beale and Okinawa. But it's a supplement to the now of course they got satellite and quite frankly between Kadena and Beale you could do satellite but not personal calls. If they heard you say, "Hi, honey," click, just didn't happen.
So what was the final phase of your service like when you were serving in Pennsylvania with the Air Guard?
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I got out of active duty in '72, and then in 1985 I found myself in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, and work-wise, after doing some law enforcement sales and all that died when Reagan shut off revenue sharing. But in the meantime, too, I'd put in an application. We had a Navy base, Navy Ships Parts Control Center there in Mechanicsburg. And the veterans guy down at the state employment said, that's the only place they even consider, really. He says, your background, you're made for them. So I put in a thing, and it took a few months, but they hired me. I worked on buying spare parts for missile launch systems on submarines. And it turned out to be kind of interesting. The other extreme from my high altitude reconnaissance and now working on subs. But the project I was on was actually working for the Royal Navy. The UK had 4 missile boats that, with their boats, built our launch system on it. And
you shared the same delivery system?
Yeah, we supported their launch system out of our supply system. It's a unique treaty we had. They're the only people we did that with. We sold parts all over the world, but we didn't supply anybody out of our supply system except on this one project. Now, what's happened since, I imagine that went away because those boats have retired and they've been replaced by Trident class type subs. But
so this was still, what would that have been?
Poseidon. Yeah, they were Poseidon boats. But I thoroughly enjoyed being part of the project because their headquarters for their special projects in the UK was Bath. And my family, my father's side of the family came from Bath. So I felt right at home being involved with that. And it was fun. I enjoyed it. But after I got on there, I also went and joined the Pennsylvania Air National Guard out at Middletown, the Harrisburg International Airport. And we had the 193rd Special Operations Group out there that did psychological operations.
It was your previous clearance that?
Well, that didn't hurt. Actually, this guy, some of you I haven't told you about. I'm also an EMT, or was an EMT, and I was in an EMT class there in Pennsylvania to get certified for Pennsylvania. My partner I ended up with was another young fellow who shared the same birthday I have, although I was more his father's age. And he was a ham, and he was in the Air Guard. And I was in the radio, the ground radio operator, and he mentioned that one of the guys had gone AWOL or just disappeared. He just decided he didn't want to do it anymore. Well, never thought more about it. Well, later I thought, well, gee, I want to join the Guard. I went and talked to them, took all their physical, was honest with them and told them I'm a colorblind, so I shot myself out of some jobs there. But he just asked me if I was colorblind. He didn't even test me, but I was honest with him. And then he tested me to figure out exactly what my problem was, because he had time. He wasn't anybody else there. So, but anyway, they were then trying to figure out what to do with me. Where could they put me as a staff sergeant? Where could they plug me in? And the only thing he came up with right off the top of their head was as a parachute packer. I said, whatever, I went to the shop. I said, I can do this. At least anymore, you don't have to jump with one of them. So, just make sure you're doing them right. But so okay, at least they'll get me in, and I can do something different later. Well, the major that was going to swear me in started talking to me about, so I was prior service. A lot of the guys in the Guard are, but he says, what's your background? Well, I went through all the stuff I'd done. He says, what the heck have they got you going into? I says, parachute packing. He says, no, not on my bet. He says, he went to the recruiter. He says, you plug him any place that he wants. I don't care if it's an overage or not. And I said, well, I'm a ham radio operator. And the guy says, I think we're missing a guy in the radio shop. I said, yes, you are. I happen to know about that. So I went in there. So I was a ground radio operator.
Can you say, talk about, what was the NBC drill? The nuclear, biological, chemical?
Oh, yes. Well, chemical suits were a big thing then, because our supposed mission, if the guys in Europe got sent to the Middle East, because even in the 80s it was still there was stuff going on there then too, that we would go to Europe to supplement, take their place, and of course then chemical threat was a big thing. So we had our little chemical suits that we had to wear periodically. You want to lose weight in a hurry, that's gas mask, the whole bit. Well, because we were radio operators and we typed messages when we got them, every 3 months we had to take a test, and the standard typewriter for ground radio back then was an MC88. It was a manual typewriter that only typed in caps. And we had to take this test wearing our full chemical suit with gloves, gas mask and all, and do 25 words a minute. I can do it. And when these secretaries complain about doing secretarial work, I said, dear, try this.
Well, I'm sure the chemical gloves are probably...
Oh, yeah, you have to do it like this. I'm not a fast typist anyway, but I was astounded that I could pass that test.
Is that like the hazing process of the Air Force?
Yeah.
The Air Force radio man?
Yeah. But it was interesting. It was, but the operation itself, they had 8 C-130s and 4 of them, one configuration for another, and they went out and messed with people's minds. It was the most active reserve or guard unit in the country. There was not an active duty unit doing this. They were the ones doing it.
Did they go over to Grenada?
Yes. They had a plane there 2 hours before anybody else got there. They were messing with their minds early on. They were very active. The thing that made me kind of mad later when I got shot down out of doing with my color vision is they also did communications. That's in fact what I ended up in, was the communications squadron. And the NCO that ran it said, I wish you'd been able to pass that color vision. He says, I needed a telephone guy in Germany for months. I worked for the phone company in my younger days. I would have loved it. And he showed me different colors. I could tell him what colors they were. The deal was done. Or I could have gone TDY over to Germany for a while. Wait, that was before I got fully involved there at the Navy base. But anyway, so.
Mr. Roberts, it sounds like you've had a very broad experience of life in the Air Force.
Yes.
Now, is there anything else for the camera? Well, first of all, I suppose I should ask you, did you earn any medals or service ribbons?
Well, nothing too dramatic except for one. Usual, the longevity, the good conduct, the medals for being in Vietnam. But yeah, the Westover, in fact, I didn't even know we had these coming to us until I was there in the Air Guard, and the personnel went and researched everybody in the unit and got all their decorations and actually made them up on on the thing for them to wear. I had the presidential unit citation with 4 clusters. So in the 4 years, we earned it 5 times. So our mission was important.
Now, did your life in the service, did your performance, did your duty influence the way you think about war and about?
Well, it gave you a little better insight to what's going on, yes. That, and believe it or not, when I was in Japan, I say we were 6 minutes from Russia by air, I had a ham station set up, plus we had the Mars station, which was right behind the photo lab, so I had use of both. And the Russians greatly encouraged ham radio operators and model airplane flyers, for that matter, because that's their future engineers and technicians. And so there was a lot of hams I talked to that were Russian, spoke as good or better English than we do. And we could tell by their call signs if it was a military station or not. And they were just rat GIs like we were. We were careful not to say certain things to keep them from getting in trouble. I mean, not that anybody's going to come down on us, but we didn't want them to get something done to them or yelled at because of something that was discussed. So, but it was fun. In fact, some of them we got to know them a little bit. You know, like I say, they were just GIs like we were. It kind of gives you a little different view of things.
Now, did you join any veterans organizations?
Yeah, for a long time I never did, but I got back here to Simsbury and joined the local VFW. It's a good group. Most of the gentlemen there are World War II, a few, 1 or 2 Korean War, I think. I think I'm the only Vietnam vet, and then there's one from Desert Storm, I think.
And a question that's common among Vietnam veterans or shared experience. Did you ever experience any discrimination when you returned home from your tour?
Not the way some did. The disappointing thing to me was that in particular, one of the places I worked, nobody there had ever been a GI. I was the only GI there. They didn't look down on me about it. It was just kind of like, gee. Now, I did work for the telephone company for a little while, and they purposely hired ex-GIs because they knew the quality they'd be. But I never had anybody throw things at me. Now, they may have looked the other way sometimes when they might have been nice otherwise. I know I did apply for one job here in Simsbury. I won't name the company. But the guy, I didn't know if they were hiring or not anyway, but I was just hitting all the possibilities. And he says, I just hate to do this. He says, I never turn away a GI, but he says, I've taken people I don't have a place for now. I just can't do anything. I mean, it was sincere. I said, hey, don't worry about it. I understand that side of it. But so there were some that really cared,
Great to hear.
Yeah.
Now, are there any stories that you feel like you'd like to share in this interview that we perhaps haven't covered?
Oh my, we've talked about so much. I guess because of my ham radio work, talking to people all over the world, my work in recon, looking at people all over the world, and the intelligence stuff. I'm on the net all the time. It's just a constant learning thing. And also something I did, thinking back to something you mentioned when we were talking before we did this, you were talking about studying a particular type of history. I did go to college finally in the 80s.
You utilize the GI Bill?
No, actually I did that when I worked for the phone company. This was past that, but I didn't need it. $13 a semester hour, at a state university with a PhD teaching the course. No, that's fine. But I had high course history in high school. It's a joke. We got into history in college, and you find all this went on, and then even then we're just scratching the surface, but I was like, good grief. Well, study. Of course, I like the History Channel and all these stuff on TV, and just it's fascinating to really get. And of course, now after Vietnam, a lot of stuff comes to play. And with my knowledge of what I knew at the time, it fills in. Some of this fills in places that I didn't know about at the time. It's interesting, although it seems like people can't learn. It's about history repeating itself.
Well, hopefully this interview will bring another layer of insight, a human face to the history of the 20th century.
It's. I thoroughly enjoyed my time in the service. I actually, when I went to Beale, I'd planned on doing the 20 at least. And just when my son was born, his mother had some medical problems, and they wanted her back close to family, and that was here, not in California. So, and there wasn't any way I could get reassigned close. So, the option was to get out. So,
either way, it sounds like you spent many years in the service, and I'd like to thank you for your time in the Air Force.
Oh, I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was strictly a fluke. I ended up in photography, but I had some fantastic experiences.
Well, once again, Mr. Roberts, thank you from the Veterans History Project.
Thank you for taking the time to interview me. It's been fun.